She was home the night before. By morning, she was gone. That is what makes this case feel so cold from the very beginning. Not a long disappearance with unclear timing. Not a person who drifted out of contact over days. An 84-year-old woman in her own home, last known safe one night, then missing by the next morning. A house is supposed to be the final layer of safety. When someone vanishes from inside that space, the fear changes shape instantly. It is no longer just about where she went. It becomes about who came in. Her name was Nancy Guthrie. She was 84 years old and disappeared from her Tucson-area home on February 1, 2026. Authorities later said there were signs of forced entry, that key electronics including her pacemaker app and doorbell system had gone offline, and that the case quickly shifted from a missing person concern into a suspected abduction. In the weeks that followed, investigators found blood identified as hers, recovered doorbell footage showing an armed, masked person tampering with the camera, and began receiving ransom messages. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. That is where this story begins. Not with the ransom notes, not with the masked figure, not with the later public pleas from her family. It begins with a woman inside her own home, and the awful realization that home was not enough to keep the danger out. That is what gives the case its emotional force. Because an elderly woman disappearing under these circumstances does not feel random in the ordinary sense. It feels invasive, deliberate, personal to the space itself. Investigators said her back doors were found open, and her phone and purse were left behind, which only deepened the sense that this was not a normal departure or a confused wandering case. It looked, from early on, like something had happened to her where she lived. And then the case became even stranger, because once the home itself started looking like a crime scene, the story began building in layers. First the signs of forced entry, then the disabled electronics, then the blood, then the surveillance footage of a masked, armed person at the doorbell camera, then the ransom messages. Each new detail made the case feel less like one event and more like a sequence in which someone may have prepared, entered, removed her, and then tried to control the story afterward through messages demanding payment. That is one reason this case hits so hard, because it does not begin with a body, it begins with absence, and absence is often worse in the opening of a true crime story, because it leaves the mind with too much room. Is she alive? Was she taken quickly? Was she targeted in advance? Did the person at the camera know exactly how much time they had? Was the home chosen because of who she was, or because of what the kidnappers believed they could get? Those are the questions that make an abduction case feel different from a murder case at the start. A murder fixes horror in one place. An abduction lets horror keep moving. And then there are the ransom communications. Authorities and reporting have described multiple ransom-related messages, with some treated skeptically and some viewed by the family as potentially genuine. More recently, messages sent to TMZ demanded Bitcoin in exchange for claimed information about her whereabouts or kidnappers. That detail matters because ransom notes change the emotional architecture of a case. The moment money enters, the disappearance stops feeling only violent and starts feeling transactional too, as if someone took a human life and then tried to turn the uncertainty itself into leverage. That is where the real opening lands. An 84-year-old woman in her own home, a forced entry, a masked figure on camera, blood left behind, ransom messages arriving afterward, and the unbearable fact that, even now, the story does not begin with certainty. It begins with a woman who should have been safest where she slept and was gone by sunrise. Once investigators began describing what they found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the case stopped looking like a disappearance in the ordinary sense. It started looking like a removal. That distinction matters. A disappearance leaves open the possibility that someone left on their own, became confused, or drifted beyond the edge of ordinary contact. A removal feels different. It suggests interruption. It suggests force. It suggests that the victim's final known space was not simply the last place she was seen, but the place where someone else took control of what happened next. In Nancy Guthrie's case, authorities said there were signs of forced entry, open back doors, blood identified as hers, and missing digital traces from devices that should have recorded part of the night. That is not the profile of a normal departure. It is the profile of a home that may have been entered, altered, and used. That is one of the coldest things about this story. The person at the center of it was 84 years old. That changes the emotional weight immediately. An elderly woman alone at home does not represent opportunity in the harmless sense. She represents vulnerability. The public hears a case like this and instinctively understands what makes it so frightening. Not just that someone vanished, but that the person who vanished may have been chosen precisely because she was easier to overpower, easier to isolate, and harder to protect in the middle of the night. That possibility hangs over every detail in the case. And then there is the digital silence. Authorities said key electronics went offline, including systems connected to her home and even tools used by family to monitor aspects of her well-being. That matters because modern disappearances are often solved or narrowed by the digital residue people leave behind. Doorbells record movement, phones reveal location, apps signal routine, devices create timelines. When those systems go dark around the same window in which a woman disappears, it no longer feels like passive bad luck. It feels like someone understood that being seen was the biggest threat to whatever they were about to do. That is where the masked figure becomes so important. Investigators recovered footage showing an armed, masked person tampering with the doorbell camera. That image changes the whole emotional architecture of the case. Without it, the story is still terrifying, but more diffuse. Forced entry, blood, missing woman, open questions. With it, the case suddenly has intention in visible form. Someone came to the house concealed. Someone interfered with the camera. Someone appears to have understood that the home's technology could expose them. That does not tell us everything, but it tells us this much. The disappearance did not emerge from confusion. It emerged from preparation. And preparation makes cases like this feel worse than spontaneous violence. Because spontaneous violence is terrifying for what it destroys. Planned violence is terrifying for what it reveals. Time to think, time to choose, time to gather what is needed, approach the house, disable what might record, and act anyway. If that is what happened here, then Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not begin at the moment she was gone. It began earlier, in the decisions someone made before ever stepping onto the property. That is why the ransom messages matter too, even if their credibility is uneven. Once messages demanding money enter a case, the crime changes shape again. It is no longer only about what happened in the house. It becomes about what the offenders, or those exploiting the case, believe can still be extracted afterward. AP reported that multiple ransom-related communications surfaced, and that more recent messages sent to TMZ demanded Bitcoin. Some were viewed skeptically, but the family believed at least certain contacts could be genuine. That ambiguity is its own cruelty. In abduction cases, communication does not always relieve fear. Sometimes it weaponizes it further. Every new message dangles the possibility of life and the possibility of fraud at the same time. And that is what makes this middle section of the story so unbearable. There is still no body, no final scene, no fixed ending. Instead, there is a house that now looks violated, a woman who remains missing, blood that says something violent touched the space, a masked intruder on camera, and messages that keep pulling the family back into the worst question possible. Is she still out there somewhere? And are these people actually connected to what happened? That question can hollow out a case. Murder has one kind of finality. Abduction mixed with ransom has another kind of torment entirely. It forces everyone to keep imagining movement after the crime. Transport, confinement, negotiation, delay, false hope, real hope. The mind never gets to stop. Once a case has forced entry, blood, surveillance footage, and ransom messages all living in the same story, it stops feeling like one crime. It starts feeling layered. That is what makes Nancy Guthrie's disappearance so deeply unsettling. The first layer is the home invasion itself. Someone enters the house of an 84-year-old woman, and by morning she is gone. The second layer is concealment. Electronics go offline, a doorbell camera is tampered with, and the visible record of the night is partially attacked. The third layer is leverage. Ransom communications appear, turning the family's fear into something someone may be trying to use. Each layer makes the case darker because it suggests not just violence, but structure. And structure is what gives crimes like this their coldest quality. A spontaneous act is terrifying because it erupts. A structured act is terrifying because it was built. If investigators are right about the signs at the home, then whoever came there may have already understood the environment before stepping inside it. They knew enough to approach at night. They knew enough to interfere with the camera. They may have known enough to understand that an elderly woman alone in her home represented the kind of target who could be overpowered before help arrived. That is not chaos. That is selection. That is why the masked figure on the doorbell video matters so much. It is not just evidence. It is a glimpse of intention. A person does not approach a house armed and masked, then tamper with the camera, without understanding that they are moving from preparation into action. Even though the footage does not answer every question, it changes the emotional reality of the case. Nancy Guthrie did not simply disappear from a house that later looked suspicious. There is visual proof that someone hostile was there, near the same system that should have recorded the truth. That makes the home feel less like a location and more like a chosen site. And then there is the family, because in cases like this, families are not only grieving, they are being held inside uncertainty in real time. That is a different kind of suffering. A murder case eventually forces the mind toward finality, however brutal that finality may be. An abduction-style case with ransom elements keeps reopening the possibility that the victim is alive, suffering, hidden, movable, negotiable. That means every hour becomes morally exhausting. Every message matters too much. Every silence matters too much. Every new lead carries the weight of hope and fraud at the same time. That is what ransom does to a case. It does not simply ask for money. It colonizes time. It forces the family to live in the space between terror and possibility. If they ignore the messages, what if one was real? If they believe the messages, what if they are being manipulated by someone exploiting public fear? AP reported that some communications were treated skeptically, while relatives believed at least certain contacts could be genuine. That split is devastating, because it means the family is forced to navigate not only the loss of Nancy, but the possibility that the truth is still moving through people they cannot identify or trust. And that may be the darkest part of this entire middle phase. Not just that Nancy is gone, that the people around her are being kept psychologically captive by not knowing whether the crime is over. A disappearance with blood in the home suggests one level of violence. Ransom messages suggest something else might still be unfolding. Even if some or all of the messages are fraudulent, they still worsen the injury because they force the family to re-enter the worst moment again and again. The original act took Nancy from the house. The later messages keep taking peace from everyone left behind. This is also where the case becomes bigger than one home in Tucson, because it begins raising wider questions about vulnerability, visibility, and predation. An elderly woman living in her own home should not look like an opportunity to anyone. But in crimes like this, opportunity is often exactly what offenders think they see. Age, routine, isolation, slower response, and a target they believe can be controlled quickly. That is why the case feels so violating. It is not just a disappearance. It is the invasion of one of the few places society promises older people should still be able to trust completely. In the end, what makes Nancy Guthrie's case so unbearable is not only that she vanished, it is that the case still refuses to become past tense. That is the deepest cruelty in stories like this. A murder case, however brutal, eventually forces grief into one kind of shape. A disappearance with blood, forced entry, surveillance footage, and ransom messages does something different. It keeps the wound open. It refuses to let the family fully grieve, fully hope, or fully stop hoping. Nancy Guthrie remains missing, and as long as that is true, the The case cannot settle into one emotional reality. It stays split between fear and possibility. That is why the ransom messages matter so much, even in their uncertainty. Because they do not simply ask for money, they keep the nightmare moving. AP reported that some ransom-related communications were viewed skeptically, while the family believed at least certain contacts could be genuine, and later messages demanded Bitcoin in exchange for claimed information about Nancy's whereabouts or kidnappers. That means the people left behind are not only dealing with the original invasion of the home, they are dealing with the afterlife of that invasion, where every new message has the power to reopen terror all over again. And that changes what justice looks like here. Not a verdict, not yet. Not even a body recovered, and a clear prosecution moving forward. Right now, justice would begin with something smaller and more basic than that. An answer. Where is Nancy? Was she taken alive from that house? Who was the masked, armed person captured tampering with her camera? Who turned her home into a crime scene and then tried, directly or indirectly, to turn her disappearance into leverage? Those are the questions at the center now, and none of them have been resolved publicly. That is what gives the case its terrible weight. An 84-year-old woman in her own home should represent the farthest edge of ordinary safety. Instead, this case turned home into the place where safety broke. Authorities said there were signs of forced entry, that her back doors were found open, that her phone and purse were left behind, that blood identified as hers was found, and that surveillance showed a masked person on the porch the night she vanished. Once those facts exist together, the disappearance no longer reads like mystery in the gentle sense. It reads like violation in stages. And the age at the center of the case makes it even harder to absorb. Not because older victims matter more, because older victims make vulnerability impossible to ignore. A younger person disappearing can trigger the mind into imagining movement, independence, impulsive choices, hidden plans. An 84-year-old woman taken from her own home after forced entry and blood evidence points the mind somewhere much darker, much faster. It suggests someone saw age not as something to protect, but as something to exploit. That may be the most haunting lesson in the whole case. Not just that someone can disappear from a house, that a house can be studied, approached, entered, stripped of visibility, and turned into a place of removal. The masked figure on the doorbell footage matters because it kills the last illusion that this was confusion or accident. Someone was there, someone interfered with the camera, someone approached the house prepared enough to conceal identity and manage the scene. That is not drift, that is design. So what remains now is not closure, it is exposure. Exposure of how vulnerable an ordinary life can become. Exposure of how technology can both reveal and fail. Exposure of how disappearance, when mixed with ransom, can trap a family in permanent emotional suspension. And exposure of one fact no one can soften. Nancy Guthrie should have been safest where she slept, and something or someone took that safety apart, piece by piece. That does not make this a finished story. It makes it an honest one. A woman was home at night. By morning, she was gone. There were signs of forced entry, blood, a masked figure, and messages asking for money. And even now, the case remains stuck inside the most agonizing kind of uncertainty. The kind where the truth may still be out there, moving just beyond reach, while the family is forced to keep living in the shadow of one unbearable question. What happened to Nancy Guthrie? And somewhere out there, the truth about Nancy Guthrie may still be waiting to be uncovered. So what do you think really happened that night? Comment your theory below, and subscribe for more real cases, disturbing disappearances, and hidden stories that refuse to be forgotten.